Dr. Moorman is a professor at NC State University and the coordinator of the Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology program. He has a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science in Wildlife Ecology and Management from the University of Georgia, and a PhD in Wildlife Ecology and Management from Clemson University. Prior to becoming a research and teaching professor, Dr. Moorman spent 9 years as a wildlife extension specialist with NC State. His research includes investigations of land management activities and land use changes on both game and non-game wildlife species across the southern U.S. And finally, in addition to many other things, he's a certified wildlife biologist and the past chair of the North Carolina Prescribed Fire Council. So he's quite the wildlife expert, and today Dr. Moorman will be talking about some of his latest research seeking to understand the effects of prescribed fire on wildlife species across the South. So, welcome, Dr. Moorman, and go right ahead. Thank you very much.
So, glad to be here. Thanks, everybody, for sitting in during their lunch break. I will try to either provide some entertainment, definitely pass along some information, hopefully stimulate some thought. I'm going to try to condense some complicated information into about a 45-minute presentation. So hopefully everything will come across well. If not, definitely I want you to ask me questions at the end of the period. So what I'm going to do is actually cover 3 projects that I've worked on with collaborators and graduate students, and I'll introduce those collaborators as I talk about each project. And I chose these 3 projects because to me they represent some consistent concerns when implementing prescribed fire and its effects on wildlife. I definitely want to acknowledge that prescribed fire is a key, if not the most important, wildlife habitat management tool in the Southeast, but there are always some consistent concerns. So I'm going to talk about 3 projects that address those concerns directly or indirectly. The first project will investigate the effects of prescribed fire on leaf litter obligates, notably woodland salamanders and shrews. Both of these taxa live in the leaf litter. They eat the insects and other arthropods in the leaf litter, and they also depend on moist environment. Woodland salamanders respire through their skin. They require moist environment for that. And shrews have a high rate of evaporative water loss, so most shrew species require moist environments. So prescribed fire that consumes the leaf litter can have a detrimental effect on these species. The second project will look at the effects of prescribed fire on ground nesting birds, and specifically we've just finished a project looking at the effects of fire during the growing season, when wild turkeys are nesting on wild turkey nest survival. And then lastly, on the same study site where we looked at wild turkey nest survival, I'll talk about a study of the effects of prescribed fire, notably growing season fire on acorns and other wildlife food. Specific to those wildlife foods will be forage for white-tailed deer, understory soft mast, overstory acorn availability, and persimmon fruit availability. And in the end, I'll wrap up with some consistent themes or some lessons learned across these 3 studies. So the first study is long-term response of salamanders, woodland salamanders, and shrews to fire and fuel reduction treatments in the southern Appalachians. My collaborators there were Dr. Katie Greenberg of Bent Creek Experimental Forest and Tom Waldrop of the U.S. Forest Service Station at Clemson University. And this project was one of the study sites for the Fire and Fire Surrogate and the National Fire and Fire Surrogate Study funded by the Joint Fire Sciences Program. So, as I mentioned before, some relevant environmental change following prescribed fire can be reduction in leaf litter cover and depth, also reduction in duff depth. Also, there can be a canopy reduction with more intense fires that cause overstorm mortality. When canopy cover is reduced, you get more sunlight through the canopy and potentially greater ground temperatures. Conversely, a decrease in canopy can lead to an increase in herbaceous layer as you get more sunlight to the forest floor. So all these, the combination of these different changes in the environment resulting from prescribed fire or variable types of prescribed fire can affect ground-dwelling wildlife or leaf litter-dwelling wildlife species. So what do we know about these ground-dwelling wildlife and how they respond to fire? Generally, studies have shown that these species have a neutral effect or only a short-term effect to fire. Studies of woodland salamander response to fire, primarily in the southern Appalachians, have shown neutral effects, no effects of single prescribed fires, and these are just some examples of the literature. There are actually other studies out there. And then one study by Mark Ford and colleagues showed that even with 2 low-intensity fires, the salamanders didn't seem to be affected. The same holds true for shrews, maybe fewer studies of shrews, but similar results. One study by Greenberg et al., which actually was the first phase of the study I'm going to talk about, did show that shrews declined temporarily following a single high-intensity fire. The one consistency in what we know based on research in terms of these responses is that studies tend to be short-term, naturally because funding doesn't last very long. They typically are after a single fire, so especially in the southern Appalachians where fire is not common, a lot of these studies only come after a single fire. And they tend to be after low-intensity fires that don't cause canopy mortality. So we need to know more about the additive effects of repeated fires, especially fires that may lead to canopy mortality. So this study, as I mentioned, is phase 2 of that Greenberg and Waldrop study that was done initially in the early 2000s. So we came back years later and did what we call phase 2, and I'll describe this in a second. But the study was conducted at Green River Game Land. You can see the acreage here. It's in western North Carolina. I'll show you a map in a second. Here's the elevation. It's primarily oak hickory overstory with Table Mountain and pitch pine on the ridge tops. The understory is rhododendron and mountain laurel. These species are definitely the fuel hazards, and they've crept up slope with fire suppression. And these sites that were used in the experiment had not been thinned or burned for 50 years prior to the study. So here's shows the location of Green River Game Lands. This is a game land owned and operated by the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and it's in Polk County, North Carolina. And you can see here these blue spots are 3 replicates of 4 treatments, and I'll describe these treatments in a second. But this is replicate 1 or block 1, block 2, block 3, and each of these blocks contains 4 treatments. So as I said, the design was 3 replications. There were 3 treatments plus a control, so 4 treatments ultimately. Each one of these is 10 hectares. So the treatments were twice prescribed burns. So we're looking at kind of an additive effect of 2 consecutive burns. The first was in 2003, and then the first series of studies was done after that burn, and then the second was done in 2006. These are dormant season burns. The 2003 burns were in March. The 2006 burns were in February. Treatment 2 was mechanical removal of the rhododendron mountain laurel understory, hand removal, and the stems were left laying in place. And this was done in 2002. And then that fuel was allowed to age or season. And then in 2003, another treatment was implemented where the mechanical understory cut had occurred in 2002, but then it was followed with another burn in 2003 and 2006. So the treatments are twice burn, 03, 06, mechanical understory 02, mechanical understory 02 plus burns in 03 and 06. So the burns occurred at the same time. And as you might imagine, this mechanical understory plus 2 burns created some pretty hot fires with that fuel laying on the ground. And in general, the study design followed the National Fire and Fire Surrogate Study design. So this is a 2006 photo of the control sites, untreated, never thinned, never burned, or haven't been thinned or burned in 50 years. This is the mechanical, and this is in 2006. So the mechanical understory removal was not repeated in 2006. It was only done in 2002. So you can see some of the stuff sprouting back here. This is actually a drift fence array, and this is what we used to capture the critters that we studied. This is a twice burn, so this is in 2006. This is the growing season after that second burn. You can see there's sprouts coming back. some sign of the fires, maybe limited overstory mortality, but some mid-story mortality. And then this is the mechanical plus 2 burns, again in 06, and you can see substantial sprouting back the growing season after that second burn in 06. And again here's the drift fence array we use to capture our critters. So you also note the overstory mortality here. So just briefly, this was done separate from our study, but the fire temperatures were tracked mostly by Tom Waldrop's group. The first burns in 2003, you can see in the burn treatments that the temperatures were 180 degrees Celsius, but the point to make is here in the mechanical removal and burn, the fires were much hotter and led to overstory mortality. Whereas with the second burns, you still had a distinctive difference between the two treatments, but the fires weren't quite as hot in the mechanical plus twice burned sites. But again, there was continued overstory mortality from the really hot fires there. So what we did was we sampled herpetofauna, and these are lizards, primarily lizards and salamanders and shrews in these sites. So for this phase 2 study, we sampled these critters from May to August in 2006 and 2007. The 2006 being that same growing season after those dormant season fires. We used drift fence arrays. We had 3 per treatment unit. There were 12 treatment units. So just to explain a drift fence array, it's a Y-shaped array. These are buckets. These circles are buckets, and these are 5-gallon buckets. So the critter hits the fence, goes along it, and falls in the bucket. Many of you are probably familiar with this. There are also funnel traps here, these blue things on both sides, but they didn't capture much, so I wouldn't worry about them as I go forward. So there are four of these pitfall traps per array. We captured shrews, as you see here. We captured woodland salamanders, primarily a white-spotted slimy salamander, seen here. And lizards, this is an eastern fence lizard. We also captured other lizard species. This was one of the more common species we captured, though. So I'm going to have a series of graphs that show the response that we documented. So I'm going to explain this graph, and then the rest will be the same. So on the y-axis, there's my arrow. On the y-axis here, we have captures per 100 trap nights. That's really 100 array nights. So per 100 nights that we ran the array, this is the numbers of captures. And then the blue is 2006, and the red is 2007, and then we have our 4 treatments down here along the x-axis. So you can see that for all shrew species combined, that's 5 shrew species, the 2 burn treatments, both the twice burned and the mechanical plus twice burned sites, had lower shrew captures than the other unburned sites. So there seemed to be consistency in how the burning was affecting shrews. However, the differences were not significant. You can see there's substantial error bars on these responses, these means, and that's largely because we only had 3 replicates. It's very difficult to replicate these landscape scale experiments, as you probably are aware. Those are standard error bars. So our most commonly captured shrew species was the southeastern shrew, and it accounted for about half of our captures, so we analyzed it separately. And again, you can see that the shrew captures were lower in the 2 burn treatments, both the twice burned and the mechanical and twice burned, but this was especially the case in that first year. And you look here, you can see that for southeastern shrew, those captures were lowest in that first year after the burn, and this is when that consumption of the leaf litter would have been most substantial, because there would have been a recovery of leaf litter for the following year to some degree, especially in the 2 burn sites. So there's some indication that the consumption of leaf litter caused a temporary reduction in southeastern shrew abundance. So moving on to the woodland salamander response, this is all salamanders together. This is 4, maybe 5, I think 5 total species of salamanders were captured. And some interesting results here. Again, you can see that salamander captures are lowest in the mechanical plus twice burned. Right here. And in both years, indicating that the additive effects of the fire, especially the hot fires that reduced the overstory, had a negative effect on woodland salamanders, and this will be expected because other studies have shown that woodland salamanders decline following timber harvest or removal of the overstory through timber harvest. Now, interestingly, you'll see that the highest number of captures were in the twice burned site, and this is a pattern that I've seen in another study or two that I've been involved with, and you also see it in the literature, in that salamander captures often increase following low-intensity prescribed fires. Often not substantially, but maybe there's a pattern there, a consistent pattern, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit as I wrap up this study. And then lastly, looking at lizard response. There's fairly little research out there on lizard and other reptile response to disturbance, to timber harvest, or to prescribed fire. So this is important information, and it's as you would expect that lizards increased in that mechanical plus twice burn treatment, where the overstory was reduced, ground temperatures were increased, more sunlight, so better thermoregulatory opportunities for a reptile like lizards. So again, you can see here, this was for both years, significant doubling in captures in the mechanical plus twice burn. But notice the burns were no different than the control, indicating that burning alone, low intensity burning alone, did not affect lizards. So there were, Tom Waldrop's group measured some of the habitat changes following these treatments, and some notable results are that leaf litter depth was lower in both the burn, the twice burn, and the mechanical twice burn. As would be expected, fire consumed the leaf litter. Also, the duff depth was lowered in the mechanical plus twice burn sites. The canopy cover was lower, as I mentioned before, in the mechanical plus twice burned. However, the downwoody debris was not different among treatments, which is surprising given that the canopy was falling apart, but we didn't see that. And also, early studies indicated that the arthropod abundance was not different. So the mechanisms driving those responses in the species would seem like it would tie back into the reduction in leaf litter depth and the reduction in canopy cover, and the changes in maybe the microclimate resulting from that. So the implications of the study, just to kind of wrap up, is that fire that reduces overstory is likely to negatively affect salamanders. And this is kind of a duh statement, because we know this from a lot of studies of timber harvest effects on salamanders, and that mechanical plus twice burn substantially reduced the overstory to the point where I often jokingly called it an undercover clear cut. But it benefited, in turn, it benefited lizards and probably other reptiles. So there's always winners and losers, and I'll talk about this in a second. The effects of low-intensity fires based on this study and previous studies are limited, short-term, likely negative effect on some shrews temporarily as the leaf litter is reduced, but there are other shrews that may respond positively to an increase in herbaceous layer, more grasses and forbs, notably leaf shrews. There's also some indication that salamanders increase after fire, and some people have surmised this is related to detectability. So when we do these measures, we need to control for how detectable these individuals are. So when you reduce the leaf litter cover, it could be that salamanders are moving around more because maybe they're more exposed, or maybe could be there's more food, but for whatever reason they may be moving more. So in that case, they'll be more likely to be detected or captured. So we need more studies that account for detectability. That's easier said than done, and I won't get into that, but it's quite difficult. We also need some longer-term studies to continue to track the additive effects, especially of fire only. So we have just Katie Greenberg, Tom Waldrop, and I guess me as a subcontractor have received funding to continue this study and look at the changes after a third burn. So we'll get to see if the effects of 3 burns maybe starts to mimic that more intense fire that occurred in the mechanical plus twice burn. So now I'm going to change here, and I'm going to move on to a study of growing season fire effects on wild turkey nest survival. And this resulted from Eric Kilberg's master's thesis, and the collaborators were Dr. Chris DePerno, Dr. Craig Harper, and Dr. David Cobb. All those folks were on Eric's master's thesis committee. So based on the literature and experience, I'm sure many of you field practitioners have these experiences that there are many potential benefits of fire, notably growing season fire on wild turkeys. One is improved visibility so turkeys can see predators. Another is increase in spring and summer forage and brood cover. These last two would occur with growing season fire, leading to reductions in woody cover and increase in herbaceous cover, grasses and forbs that would provide more food and brood cover, more arthropods for turkeys. Then there are some potential disadvantages: direct destruction of nests if fire is occurring during the nest season, direct mortality of poults if they got burned up, potential reduction of nest cover. Growing season fire, there may not be time for vegetation to recover so turkeys can nest there with structure, and potentially temporary or short-term reduction in forage right after the burns. All that said, at least what I heard of for years is this concern about nest destruction by growing season fire. And I'm under the impression that in some cases this concern may even limit the application of growing season fire because of the concern about destruction of wild turkey nests and other ground nesting species nests. So we set out to address this, and we did so in what I would consider an appropriate place, a place where growing season fire is applied at a grand scale. And this is on Fort Bragg Military Reservation in the Sandhills of North Carolina. You can see here, Fort Bragg has over 100,000 acres of woodland. It's primarily upland longleaf pine wiregrass community. And the goal is to burn all of the longleaf pine woodland on a 3-year return interval. And they're fairly successful at that, differing from one year to the next, so that in any given year, at least 1/3 of the longleaf pine community would be burned during the growing season. Now, that growing season extends from April to August, but a lot of that burning occurs in late April, May, and June when wild turkeys are nesting. So I'm just going to go briefly over the cover types on Fort Bragg because they kind of form the base of the rest of this talk I'm giving today. So the primary cover type on the base is the upland longleaf pine with wiregrass understory. There also are rare or small dispersed inclusions of upland hardwoods. They're not going to play a role in this turkey study, but the next study we will address them. So keep in mind there are upland hardwood inclusions in this longleaf pine matrix. There are also bottomland hardwood drainages. Actually, I'm going to go back a couple of slides. And one other note about Fort Bragg is all these lines you see going east-west, all these lines east-west are fire breaks. And that's both to allow the aggressive fire program and also to facilitate military training activity. And then the north-south are drains. So we got north-south fire breaks through drainage and east-west through fire breaks. Makes for a lot of fairly consistent burn blocks. So those drainages, as you can see here, over here on the left, this is what we call bottomland hardwood, or this is hardwoods, mostly gum and maple that occurred along drainages. And then on the right, we have our typical upland pine, upland longleaf pine, but then there's also what we call this ecotone condition that occurred in the transition between the bottomlands and the uplands. And this was we assigned it a unique cover type value because in the end it plays an important role in wildlife habitat on the base. And we assigned anything within 20 meters of a riparian zone to be ecotone. Using a GIS, we did that. And the last cover type was what we called open or non-forested. These are landing zones for paratrooper activity, firing points, and other military training areas. And they're mowed or often burned pretty frequently during the dormant season. You can see here this is a recently burned site. They do usually come back in forbs and grasses with some patchy shrubs. So to conduct the study, we captured hens using rocket nets in 2011 and 2012. We captured hens from January to March using rocket nets. You can see a hen here under the net. We stored them in boxes so we could work them up. We worked them up, measured them, and we attached both GPS data loggers, or either attached a GPS data logger or a VHF transmitter to turkeys. Most of the attachments in the first year were GPS, and the second year we attached primarily VHF transmitters to focus more on the nesting aspect of the study. So using the VHF, which is on both the GPS and VHF transmitters, we're able to track hens on the ground. So we located hens 3 times a week, and when they started to get sedentary, indicating they were on a nest, we just flagged that nest around at a distance and waited for the nesting to complete the cycle. And then we determined the fate of that nest, either based on knowing the incubation duration. If it was a short incubation, we knew it failed, and based on the eggshells. You can see here the circular nature of the pipping or breaking of the eggshell indicates that that was a successful nest. So overall, we captured and radio tagged 65 hens, but we only located 42 nests on the base. We located some nests off the base. In the first year, we tagged a lot of juvenile hens, and none of them nested, so that's why some of our nest number is less than our hen number. So we located 42 nests that we could analyze for habitat selection. We also monitored 30 nests for survival. And the reason this number is less than the 42 is that several nests were either found opportunistically by flushing the hen, or accidentally researchers flushed the hen, and when the hens were flushed, they often abandoned the nest. So we only looked at nests that hadn't been disturbed for survival. So that's 30. Of those 30, there was only 1 that was destroyed by fire. 1 was abandoned based on military activity. 16 nests were depredated, and then 12 nests successfully hatched young. So of the 30, we had 12 successful nests. So just briefly to describe this graph, on the y-axis we have percent, and this is either percent of all nests, as you see here in the blue, or it's percent of the land cover on the base, which is in red. And what this graph is going to show you is selection of nest sites by hens on the base. And this is for all 42 nests we located on the base. So first, I want you to note that over 50% of the nests that we found were in that ecotone, that narrow 20 meters of transition between the bottomlands and the uplands. Yet less than 10% of the base is an ecotone. Conversely, less than 20% of the nests were in upland pine, although over 70% of the base is upland pine cover type. So this tells us that hens were selecting ecotone for nest sites and avoiding the upland pine. We also used a statistical package to estimate nest survival in the upland and lowland sites. So the upland site included both the upland pine stands and the military openings, and then the lowland included the ecotone and bottomland, although the lowland sites were primarily ecotone because that was the most prevalent nesting site location. But you can see here that nests in the uplands had very low chance of survival, and actually we had no nests that survived in the uplands. So this is greater than 0 because the statistical package is estimating that some nests would be successful if we had a larger sample size. In the lowlands along the ecotones and bottoms, all 12 of our nests that survived were there, and our estimate is that 50 to 60% of nests would survive there, which is fairly high in the literature. All right, so this is I think this is a very interesting graph. It's going to take me a little while to explain this, but what we wanted to do is kind of model the potential for a fire exposure to nest, or model the potential for nests to be destroyed by fire. Obviously, we directly documented only 1 of 30 nests got destroyed, but we also want to kind of model risk. And we did this by multiplying the percentage of the base that burned during the nesting season, during every week during the nesting season, by the percentage of nests that were active during that week. So here on the y-axis you can see this is the percent of nests that would be potentially exposed to fire during any given week during the nesting season. And note that this is less than 1%. So the very highest value on this y-axis is 1%. And you can see that, let me get my arrow out here, you can see that there's a peak here, and this is when the nesting season would have peaked in late April, early May, and then it kind of tails out as the nesting season ends. If you add up all of these weeks of potential risk, that's approximately 6% of nests, at least on Fort Bragg, given the acreage of land that was burned during the nesting season and the distribution of nesting activity across that nesting season. So to give you some values, in 2011, 19% of the base was burned during the growing season, and then in 2012, 31% of the base was burned during the growing season. So in 2012, they reached their goal of having about a third of the base burned during the growing season. Of those burns that occurred during the nesting season we documented for turkeys on Fort Bragg, 16% of the base was burned during the nesting season in 2011 and 22% during 2012. Now this assumes random distribution of nests, which did not actually occur because many of the nest sites were in areas that would not have burned in either the ecotone or the bottomland. So in reality, this number is high. On Fort Bragg, we would expect even a lower percentage of nests to be exposed to fire in any given year, which matches that 1 out of 30 number that we got. So this doesn't mean that if fire goes over a nest, it won't be destroyed. It will be destroyed. What this means is the chance that a nest and a fire come in contact at the same time is fairly low. And this is on Fort Bragg, where growing season activity, burning activity, is prevalent, maybe as prevalent as most places in the southeast. So I think this is a strong indication that growing season fire is unlikely to have significant effects on wild turkeys. And that's evidenced by the turkey population in Bragg, which is growing healthily. It's actually grown over the last decade. So in summary, 1 out of 30 nests was destroyed by fire over our 2-year study. Those fire-maintained ecotones were important nest sites. And I say fire-maintained because as the fire backed down into those hardwood drainages, it prevented succession into trees and maintained a kind of a nice mix of low shrubs, tree sprouts, and herbaceous plants, which was really important nesting sites for turkeys. Less than 6% of nests were exposed to fire, would be exposed to fire each year on Fort Bragg, and probably would be similar, much or even much less elsewhere, even where growing season fire is occurring. So implications are that growing season fire has limited influence on nest survival, so it shouldn't be a barrier to implementing growing season fire. And in addition, growing season fire may increase nesting cover in lowlands and ecotones by preventing succession to trees. However, it could have been reducing nesting cover in the uplands on Fort Bragg, especially given that Fort Bragg is a fairly low productivity site. So the frequent growing season fires there really have reduced woody cover in the uplands, and we know that wild turkeys select areas with some woody cover for nest sites, and that's probably why nesting was avoided in those uplands, and potentially even why nest predation was high there. So we would encourage some dormant season fires in uplands to increase nesting cover in the uplands for wild turkeys. Okay, so the last study I'm going to talk about is a study that's still kind of ongoing. We have several manuscripts that are in review and some that are still being developed. But this is research conducted by Marcus Lashley. He's a PhD candidate here at NC State University, and he's actually sitting here beside me, so he will be available to answer questions. The collaborators are Dr. Chris DePerno, again, and Dr. Craig Harper. And this is actually a photo here of Marcus looking at one of his transects that I'll talk about in search of soft mass that would be wildlife food. So what do we want to know from Marcus's study? First thing we want to know is what was the effect of fire season on white-tailed deer forage availability? And the fire season being either dormant season or growing season. Similarly, we wanted to look at the effects of fire season, either dormant or growing, on fruit abundance. And this is both understory fruit abundance and overstory abundance of persimmon fruits. And these could be foods for a variety of different wildlife species, obviously. And then we wanted to look at the effects of time since fire on understory fruit abundance. And this is only for growing season fire on Fort Bragg, which is the more prevalent fire season. So we looked at if it had been 1, 2, or 2+ years since fire, and to see how that affected the availability of understory fruit. And then lastly, we looked at the long-term effects of fire application on the distribution of acorns across the base, which is always a question of importance when managing for wildlife and fire-maintained systems. So our study design was similar to the previous study. Our cover types were, this was these upland hardwood inclusions I mentioned, the bottomland hardwoods that are on those north-south drainages, the upland pine stands, both dormant season stands, and that meant that the stand had received 2 consecutive dormant season fires, growing season fire stands that had received 2 consecutive growing season fires, or actually more than 2, sorry, Marcus straightened me out, more than 2 consecutive growing season fires for both of those. And then we had another set of treatments looking at time since growing season fire. So either the same growing season as the fire, the growing season following the fire, or 2 growing seasons since fire. There are relatively few stands with at least 3 growing seasons since fire on Fort Bragg. So we measured the deer forage by measuring the biomass in cages, and you can see Marcus standing here next to a cage. I believe they were 4 by 4 by 4 feet, and this is just hog wire that keeps the deer out. Just in case deer are affecting the vegetation, we want to isolate the effects of the fire treatment. We measured understory fruits along transects, and you already saw a picture of that transect earlier on the title slide. And then we also measured acorns and persimmons along a different set of 25-meter transects. To note, the understory fruits that were common on Fort Bragg were gallberry, huckleberry, blueberry, and the things that people are real familiar with. So to get to the results, a couple of points to make here. One, as you can see in the orange, represents the biomass of wiregrass, and you can see that wiregrass, as you would expect, was absent from bottomland hardwoods. It was similarly pretty similar in biomass between the dormant and growing season fires, but there was slightly less biomass of wiregrass in those upland hardwood inclusions, which will be a point I'll tie into later. We also looked at non-selected forage, and we knew that it was non-selected or selected based on another study where we actually documented what deer eat on Fort Bragg. So you can see that there's a lot of just food out there that deer are not going to eat very commonly across all the cover types, especially in the bottomland hardwood cover type. And then lastly, we looked at foods that were selected by deer. So these would be the most important foods for deer on Fort Bragg at least. And you can see here that the most biomass, the greatest biomass of selected foods was in those dormant season stands, the dormant season burn stands. Actually 5 times, approximately 5 times what was available in the growing season stands, and more than in the upland hardwood and bottomland hardwood. As I said, we also looked at soft mast by cover type. There's a lot going on here, so I'm going to try to break it down and simplify it. These different colors represent different months of the growing season, and that's important because different plant species are producing fruits different times throughout the year. So we want to actually look at some of that variability in soft mast availability. And although dormant season and growing season stands had similar soft mast availability, in any given month there was some difference. So growing season provided some fruits in months that dormant season did not, and vice versa. All right. Oops. Before I move on, the other point I want to make here is that the upland hardwood stands had 3 times more fruits per transect than any of the other cover types, and that was across almost all the months. So upland hardwoods were a significant contributor to understory soft mass production on Fort Bragg. Now, why is that? So I mentioned before that wiregrass was sparse in these upland hardwood inclusions relative to the pine stands. And you can see here, you can see fairly sparse distribution of wiregrass. And many of you have probably seen that, potentially because of the shading effects of the hardwoods, the lack of pine needles to carry consistent fire. So because of this, when fire does go through these upland hardwood inclusions, it often does so in more of a mosaic, in more of a patchy manner than it does through the pine stands themselves. So after a fire, there are patches of vegetation that are left unburned, and we surmise that's what was leaving the fruits available in the upland hardwood stands because of that patchiness of the burns as they went through the upland hardwood stands. So this not only demonstrates the importance of the upland hardwood stands, but also the importance of having patchy burns if possible. As I mentioned, we also looked at soft mast in the growing season pine stands. So note, this is growing season stands only, and we looked at years since burned. And as you might suspect, in the same year of the growing season burn, there were absolutely no fruits detected. Zero. None of our transects detected fruits. And essentially no fruits were detected in the growing season following that growing season fire. So not until we got to 2 or more years since 2 or more growing seasons since the growing season fire did we detect any fruits. So this would indicate, for example, if you were managing, if a property was being managed with a 2-year return interval using growing season fire, soft mast availability in understory would essentially be eliminated, unless there was some way to have patchy burns. And even in a 3-year burn return interval, only about 1/3 of that property is going to have fruit available, unless there's some patchiness in the burning. So as I said before, Fort Bragg is riddled with fire breaks. So a lot of the fire ignitions occur along these fire breaks. And what we noted was that where the fires were started along the fire breaks, the fires were less intense. So here is a demonstration of this kind of change in intensity as the fire moved away from the fire break. So close to the fire break here, you can see a 1 foot, burn charring about 1 foot off the ground. As you move away, it goes to 4 feet and then up to 10 feet as you get further into the stand. So the fire became more intensive and greater intensity as you moved away. We call this first 25 meters as you moved away from the fire break a lift zone, or the low intensity fire transition zone. Lifts is what we call it. So we created a new cover type to investigate the effects of this lifts. And we did this because when we first started measuring or looking for acorn production, we noted pretty quickly there were essentially no acorns in the pine stands anywhere. Yet we were seeing oak trees along the fire breaks. So we wanted to add that lifts treatment to see what percentage of acorns were available because of that low intensity fire application there along the fire breaks. So you can see here, ignore the bars on the right. We're just going to look at here on the left. And I want you to note specifically that the predominance of acorns and persimmons on Fort Bragg were either available in the lifts, those first 25 meters in the pine stands adjacent to the fire breaks, or in the upland hardwoods. And then a better way to look at this, as I'm wrapping up here, is the relative land area on Fort Bragg. On the left, you can see that most of Fort Bragg is either open military training areas at 28%, or these upland longleaf pine wiregrass stands at 36%. Yet on the right, you see that fairly low percentage of the acorns that are available on Fort Bragg, acorns and persimmons, are actually in the pine stands. If you look on the left, you can see that 17% of the land area is in lifts. So that's still upland pine stand, but that's that pine stand close to the fire breaks. Yet 80% of acorns and persimmons is in that lift zone. Same for upland hardwoods, whereas only 2% of the base is in upland hardwoods. 8% of the acorns and persimmons are in that cover type. So the take-home point is that how fire is applied can affect the prevalence of or occurrence of hardwoods and acorn-producing oaks. So the implications are that including dormant season fires in a fire prescription is important to provide forage and cover for deer. It also provided a wider diversity of soft mast availability during different months of the growing season. To have understory soft mast production, fire return intervals would need to be, at least with growing season fire, return intervals would need to be greater than 2 years. And including some strategies to protect oaks or hardwood inclusions, or oaks or hardwoods somewhere on sites, maybe using backing fires, is important for providing wildlife food. So some summary themes. Always, whenever you're talking about wildlife, you need to have your target species in mind. And I know this is where a lot of the management actually gets complex when you have two species that may have differing habitat requirements. But always define your target species. If you're managing for lizards, obviously you'd want high-intensity fires or disturbances that lessen or reduce overstory. If you're managing for salamanders, you want disturbances that don't affect the overstory. Effects of prescribed burn vary with time, even time after a single fire, but more importantly, after the additive effects of repeated fires. So we need longer-term studies that look at the additive effects of repeated fires. And that's really what we have on Fort Bragg, because Fort Bragg has a long history of fire there. So the study there on Fort Bragg is much different than the study that we did in the Southern Appalachians, where prescribed fire history is much shorter. Behavioral adaptations of animals allow coexistence with fire. In the southeastern U.S., we know that animals evolved with fire, so they're well adapted to fire. We see some of that in that salamanders are underground during the day. Turkeys are nesting in ecotones or in bottomland areas that are less likely to be burned. These all could be behavioral adaptations or just chance behaviors that allow these animals to coexist with fire. It's important to consider the historical fire regime, not only the variability in season, but also the variability in return interval that likely occurred historically. Most fires, obviously in the southeast, would have occurred during the early growing season, but fires did occur during other seasons of the year. So in wrap-up, we encourage a heterogeneous fire application when wildlife habitat or specific wildlife species are a goal, and that includes both variable fire seasons and variable return intervals within and among stands. And I want to acknowledge the funders for these studies. That includes the U.S. Forest Service, the Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology Program here at NC State, the Department of Defense, and the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. And I apologize, I didn't get to the Bachman Sparrow study, although the abstract said I would. We have lots of other fire studies ongoing. We're hoping to create a website soon on fire and fauna based on the continuing research here we have at NC State University and with other collaborators. So David, I think that's it. I can take questions now.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Moorman. So once again, if y'all join us during the presentation, my name is David Godwin, and I'm the Outreach Coordinator for the Southern Fire Exchange. And we just had a really fascinating presentation today from Dr. Chris Moorman from the NC State University. So at this point, we have some time left in our hour to take questions from the audience. The way we do questions in our webinars here is to use that chat pod, which is a little chat window in the lower right-hand corner of your window. So if y'all have questions for Dr. Moorman or for his graduate student, please go ahead and type those into the chat window, and we will field those questions and see what we can do.
So, David, a couple of comments. There's some Robert Franklin's typing in some good points that you can also vary your firing technique, which will help create heterogeneity on the landscape, and we'd include that as well, and we did mention that in the manuscript that we have in review. There's another question about how fire temperatures were measured, and I don't know. Tom Waldrop knows that better than me, or Katie Greenberg. I'm actually looking some of the manuscripts to see if I can figure that out, but it may not happen on short notice.
Sorry. I had a question. When you defined this lift zone, the boundary around your fire breaks, did you look at those same lift zones in the turkey study as well? I was wondering if the turkey nests that you identified in the upland sites, were those within the lift zones in upland areas, or could you?
That's a good question. I don't know exactly where the turkey nests were in the upland sites. There was a relatively small percentage of all our nests were in the upland sites. I do remember seeing some of them, and they were in sites that had older rough, so they would have been in the 2 years since growing season fire, where some of the turkey oak sprouts had come back, and there was some woody structure there for nest sites. Mm-hmm. Whether or not they were in the lift zones, I don't know.
The ones that I saw were not, but they were in patches in the stand generally.
So Marcus is telling me the ones he saw when he was down there were not in the lift zones, but they were in patches with woody understory structure.
Basically where the fire, just a fire shadow.
Where the fire hadn't burned so hot through the pine stand. We did look at a model to see if the woody structure was a predictor of predation risk, and it didn't come out, although there was a trend there.
Mm-hmm. And then I have one more question right now. I don't see any other questions coming in from the audience here. For those turkey nests that I wasn't quite clear, were the ecotones in the turkey study, were those ecotones natural, or was there a fire break that maintained those separations between the upland sites and those more wetter sites?
Those are natural ecotones. There are no fire breaks, or it's not a common practice to have fire breaks along the riparian zones on brag. Instead, the fires just creep down, and it's an effect of the increasing moisture that occurs as they move down towards the bottom. The fire intensity changes, the soil productivity goes up. So it's a combination, not just the fire. It also has to do with moisture and soil productivity, but all those come together to maintain that kind of ideal nesting condition for the turkeys.
Oh yeah, I just wondered. I know in some places it's pretty common to put a line around those areas, and
right.
It
that's
really
not something that's prescribed. That's not something I would recommend, because there are oftentimes rare plants there as well. So Marcus is telling me that Fort Bragg historically had those fire breaks along the drainages, but they were required to move them because of an federally endangered butterfly that occurs there, the St. Francis satyr.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know there's a lot of benefits in not having those breaks in there. Looks like we have a question here from Katie O'Donnell. She says, were salamanders monitored at all before the treatments? She says, I agree with the issue of detectability of salamanders being a problem, and wondered if you could compare pre- and post-treatment numbers, populations.
Yes. The answer is yes. They were monitored before the treatments. So Katie Greenberg's first set of papers that were published from the phase 1 of the study did actually use the pre-treatment numbers of salamanders to correct, because especially with low numbers of replication, your pre-treatment effects are important. We didn't incorporate pre-treatment numbers in the second in phase 2 because it had been so long since fire. But notably, pre-treatment conditions can drive some of your responses.
See, any other questions from the audience here? For Dr. Moorman or for his graduate student?
I want to send a shout out to Amy Raybuck down there in Florida.
I think that's the first shout out we've had on one of our webinars.
If she's still on there or not. I saw her on there.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, Amy did another study looking at the effects of fire on shrews and salamanders. I didn't include that in this presentation, but it's something we're working on finishing up in the publication process.
Oh, cool. Well, any other questions from the audience? All right. It looks like we're getting about to the end of our hour here. Let people finish up their lunch break. So thank you very much, Dr. Moorman, and thank you, Marcus, too, for joining us today. And we appreciate y'all's presentation. And thanks also to everyone else in the audience who joined us. And we hope that this webinar will be useful in your fire management and fire research programs. We do ask, you'll see a link right there in the middle of the screen, that you please, if you have the opportunity, click on that link and fill out a really quick survey. And hopefully we can use those survey results to improve our future webinars to really make sure that we're meeting the needs of the fire management and natural resource community. So as we said earlier, if you had to leave, you probably aren't hearing this. But for those who couldn't make it today, we've recorded this webinar and it'll be up on our YouTube page in about a week or so. So once again, thanks everyone for coming out today. Thanks Dr. Moorman, and y'all have a great afternoon.